Shalom, everybody. So a married couple, they are both 60 years old. The husband and the wife, they're both individually 60 years old. And they were celebrating their 35th wedding anniversary together. And during their party, a fairy appeared to congratulate them and grant each one of them a wish. The wife wanted to travel around the world. The fairy waved her hand, and poof, the wife had tickets for a worldwide cruise. Next, the fairy asked the husband what he wanted, and he said, "I wish I had a wife who was 30 years younger than me." Poof, the husband was 90. So you know what they say, be careful what you wish for. And that is certainly one of the lessons we can learn from this morning's Parashat. Understanding the deep emotional pain that Rebekah was feeling, unable to conceive, Isaac pleads, "Vaye'etar Yitzchak l'Adonai l'nochach ishto ki akarahi, vaye'atar lo Adonai v'tahar Rivka ishto." God, can you please hear the pain, the suffering of my wife, Isaac says. Can you imagine the extraordinary difficulty she is feeling in her life? And God responds to Isaac's plea, and Rebekah conceived. The answer comes immediately, without any words. We don't hear from God. We only see God's work in their lives. And wouldn't that be great if that's exactly how the system worked? Right? That we could ask for something and God would immediately give it. Wouldn't that be wonderful if that's exactly how prayer worked? If we arrived on a Shabbat morning in order to plead for something, in order to ask for something, then immediately it would appear for us. And the modern version of that is that maybe sometimes we pray for things that we don't need, but we get what we actually do need. We're just unable to see it. Isn't that possible that that's one way that prayers are answered? And that is not by giving us what we ask for, but by giving us what we need. But no matter, the power of prayer lies not in the receiving, but in figuring out what we need in the first place. The power of prayer lies not in the response that we get, but in the formulation, in the verbalization of our inner thoughts. The potency of prayer comes in forming and initiating the conversation. And yet, that is clearly not the end of the story. In the next few sentences, there is no gratitude. There's seemingly obvious gift that Rebekah had been given, and yet there is no response of gratitude. Thank you for allowing me to conceive. Thank you for allowing my wife to conceive. The next part of the sentence, the next part of the story is Vayitro tzitzu habanim b'kirba v'tomer im kein lama ze anochi v'telech lidrosh et Adonai. Rebekah says, there's something wrong inside of me. I don't know what's going on, and I'm afraid. And God's response is, Vayomer Adonai la shnei goyim bevitnech u'shnei le'umim me'imayich yiparedu le'om melom ye'ematz v'rav ya'avod tza'ir. There are two nations growing in your womb, and they are fighting with each other. It's going to be ultimately the young who has power over the older. You can imagine the moment that Rebekah is feeling. She is afraid, having not been able to conceive and not knowing what pregnancy of twins feels like, of not knowing pregnancy at all. She's concerned that there's something wrong. And again, God responds to that prayer and says, there's nothing wrong. This is the way your pregnancy will go. The request in this location is for information. And though the answer isn't a great one, it does give her some sense that she will be able to carry these children to term. Sometimes we hear things we want to hear, and sometimes all we need is to be heard. At least, again, we're in conversation, and that's what prayer is. It's a conversation between us and God. It's a conversation between us and our community. It's a conversation between us and ourselves. I had the distinct pleasure this week of listening to a lecture by Professor Benjamin Summers, who is a professor of Bible at the seminary. And it's available, if you want it, on something called ScholarStream. It's a partnership that we have engaged with the seminary. The partnership is in order to bring great scholars from around the world to make them accessible to us. And so I would encourage you, watch GHC News for the links. These are fascinating lectures that come with all sorts of source sheets. And he explains in that lecture about why it's so hard to pray today. He explains that the type of prayer that we are used to here in America is exactly the type of prayer that's offered in this morning's Parashat. He says it's deeply personal, it's individual, it's spontaneous, and therefore, by definition, he says it's self-centered. Yet, I argue it is sincere, and it is genuine. And at least it keeps us in the conversation. You see, he was trying to create a false premise, I believe, that there is a difference between Jewish prayer and American prayer. Jewish prayer is communal. It's fixed and set. American prayer, on the other hand, is not. American prayer is spontaneous. It's individualized and urgent, and comes from a place of our own deep personal needs. My concern isn't what kind of prayer you're offering, whether it be fixed or spontaneous. My concern is that people aren't praying at all. And that's, I think, the message of this morning's Parsha. We have to remain a part of the conversation. And then something really fantastic happens in this morning's Parsha. Much later, another chapter later, it says, Vayera elav Adonai vayomer al tered Mitzrayma ki shochen ba'aretz asher omer elecha. God says to Isaac, don't go down to Egypt. We've seen this story before, where Abraham earlier goes down to Egypt and it doesn't result well. And God says to Isaac, don't follow the footsteps of your father. Don't make the same mistake your father made. It's a great sermon in and of itself, but the message here is simple. God starts the conversation. I don't know if we're even listening for God in our lives, for God in our world. Here is a moment in which the content isn't as important as the message, and that is that God is starting the conversation. And then after all that had happened, there's another verse. Vayera elav Adonai balayla hahu vayomer anochi Elohei Avraham avicha al tiraki itecha anochi. One night, Isaac lays down to go to bed and he's afraid, but we're not told that in the text. What we're told is that God comes to Isaac and says, don't be afraid. How often in our lives are we afraid and we feel like we're alone in that fear? But recognize, says the Torah in this morning's Parsha, God will come to you and tell you not to be afraid. Because God sometimes starts the conversation. The problem is we're not always listening. That night, God appeared to Isaac and said, I am the God of your father, Abraham. Fear not, for I am with you, and I'll bless you and increase your offspring for the sake of my servant Abraham. And then the Or Chaim says something incredible. Chaim ibn Attar says, Al tira ki techa nochi. God says, don't be afraid. Perush lehiyot shera'a hashefala mimelech plishtim shegarshu me'artzo v'lo yada ein yifnechash. Don't be afraid. What would Isaac be afraid of? Seeing that Isaac had experienced the humiliation of the expulsion at the hands of Avimelech and didn't know where to turn next, he might have, says the Or Chaim, felt abandoned by God. That's why God reassures him, telling him not to be afraid. Sometimes in our lives, we feel abandoned. We feel alone. We've tried our best, yet we still feel isolated. So many of us feel the same way, embarrassed, ashamed, distant. And we have the most difficult time closing that gap. And so we stay away. In that moment, God sees, God does something extraordinary. God reaches out. Remember those early commercials for telephones? Yeah. Reach out and touch someone? Yeah. Shouldn't we be doing this for each other? And isn't this the model that God is teaching us in our lives, that in the most difficult times, reach out? At our lowest moments, maybe what we need is to know that someone is listening carefully. And this is the one promise I can make to you. To you sitting here in the synagogue today, to those of you who are watching at home, God is calling out to you. God is reaching out to you. Just start listening. Look, you have to find the place that's most comfortable for you so that you can hear. In all the noise and the clatter and the static in the world today, there's simply too many distractions for us. And sometimes we can't hear. Maybe you need to be doing it at home. Maybe you need to be doing it here in synagogue. I remember about 20 years ago, I took a group of people to Israel. And one of the people who came along on this journey, this pilgrimage to the Holy Land, was a convert. And she confessed to me that she was reluctant to go to the Kotel, to the Holy Wall. She said to me that she was concerned, what if she got to the wall and she didn't feel anything? Maybe that would have meant that her conversion didn't work. Maybe it didn't take. Maybe she had made a mistake. And I reassured her that something would happen. And we walked out onto the plaza right in front of the Kotel. And she went off to the women's section. And I stood there at the plaza waiting for her to return. And I don't know how long she was there, but when she returned, she was crying. And I had a huge lump in my throat. What could have happened? Maybe someone was mean to her. Maybe she didn't feel anything. And then she reached me and she said she was overwhelmed with the emotions, and she said that she could feel something powerful. And I said, of course. This week, many of us gathered with family and friends around the Thanksgiving table and paused before we ate to do something that we as Jews have always done, and that is to say thank you. We do it as Jews before we eat, and we do it after we eat, in order to ingrain in us the cycle of gratitude that's so easily dismissed after the moment. We prayed. We took a second to acknowledge the bounty we have and express gratitude for the gifts we have received. So that's what I ask you to do, not just on Thanksgiving, but every day. Continue the conversation with the Almighty. If you have been away for a long time, come back. I promise somebody will come over and talk to you. Someone will start the conversation with you. Someone will come over and say hello. And if you just want to talk to God, I promise you people will leave you alone and give you space to do just that. If you need more time because you're still not ready to return, take that time. But wherever you are, in whatever circumstance you find yourself, whether it be personal and private or public and communal, begin the conversation in the language of your soul. Whether it's in your car or on the aqueduct or at the gym, or for those who are sitting in this room right now, it's critical to our survival as individuals, as a nation, to continue the conversation with the Almighty. And that conversation we call prayer. Shabbat Shalom. We continue with Musaf, page 184.